There are moments in life when silence doesn't comfort. It presses down with weight. At 69, John Cleese finally allowed that silence to settle around him, thick like the dust inside an old theater, long after the audience has gone home. In the dim golden light of a room lit by a single lamp, he murmured a sentence he had spent a lifetime avoiding. There are five people, five faces I can't forgive, not because of what they did, but because of what they changed inside me. At this age, most people choose to look back and hold on to their gentlest memories. But for John, memory feels more like fragments of an old film reel, edges burned, every frame carrying a faint sting, a broken laugh, a friendship that cracked, a promise that dissolved into smoke. His life, from the blinding brilliance of the Monty Python stage to the long solitary nights in a writing room, has always lived between two extremes: thunderous applause and the enormous emptiness that follows when the applause dies. That night he sat motionless for a long time, as if searching through a chest of memories he'd always feared opening. The desk lamp cast a muted glow across his aging face, revealing a lifetime of exhaustion, stubbornness, sharp wit, and 1,000 unsaid things. Then he exhaled, the exhale of someone finally ready to uncover wounds he once buried deep. But who are these five people? And why, at 69, is he only now able to name them? Memory often softens childhood, but John's early years were never made of warm hues. He was born in Weston-super-Mare, a quiet coastal town where the wind always seemed to whistle through half-empty streets, carrying with it an undertone of loneliness he would only understand decades later. His father, a man shaped by the war, hid tenderness behind discipline. His mother, brilliant but fragile, lived in a constant tremor of anxiety that clung to the walls of their home like dampness no sunlight could cure. John grew up between those two temperatures, one cold and one feverish, learning early how to survive by observing, thinking, and retreating into silence. He was tall too soon, awkward too soon, and sensitive much too early for a world that did not know what to do with such sensitivity. At school, laughter was both a weapon and a shield, and he discovered instinctively that making others laugh could buy him a few moments of safety. But even as a boy, he could sense the fault lines beneath the surface. The way adults broke promises without noticing, the way affection was given in one sentence and taken away in the next. He learned to read disappointment like a second language. One evening remains etched in him more clearly than most. He was 12, sitting at the foot of the stairs while his parents argued upstairs behind a half-closed door. Their voices didn't matter. What mattered was the discovery that even the people meant to protect you could fracture right in front of your eyes. That night he realized something essential. Trust was not permanent. It was something that cracked easily, silently, sometimes without intending to. This was the seed, the quiet, trembling seed of the man who decades later would struggle to forgive. By adolescence, John had already built the first layers of his emotional armor. Not aggression, not rebellion, humor, precision, distance. He became the boy who could turn pain into punchlines, who could frame sadness as wit, who could hide fear behind intellectual elegance. But beneath that elegance lay the first true wound, the understanding that love was never stable and promises were never certain. Long before fame, long before the spotlight, this was the beginning of the man who would one day carry five names in silence. Success, when it finally came, did not arrive gently. It burst into John Cleese's life like a spotlight switched on too suddenly, flooding every corner of his world with an intensity both exhilarating and unforgiving. Cambridge was the first stage, a place where intellect was currency and wit could turn an ordinary evening into an unforgettable performance. There, John discovered not only his comedic voice, but the unsettling truth that fame begins long before the world knows your name. It starts in the tension between who you are privately and who people want you to be. At the footlights, he became the tall figure who dominated rooms with sharp lines and an even sharper presence. Audiences laughed, sometimes too loudly, as if trying to claim a piece of him. John understood early that laughter was not just approval, it was expectation. And expectation, he knew from childhood, was a fragile bridge that could collapse under too much weight. Still, he walked it, because brilliance has its own momentum, and his was impossible to contain. Then came radio, television, writing rooms filled with cigarette smoke and egos, late-night rehearsals, and the unmistakable feeling that he was stepping into a version of himself he had once only imagined. Fame expanded around him like a universe that kept inventing new galaxies. And at the center of that universe, Monty Python emerged. Chaotic, irreverent, revolutionary. The troupe rewrote the rules of comedy, but for John, it also rewrote the rules of his life. People no longer saw the quiet, observant boy from Weston-super-Mare. They saw the towering comic genius who could bend absurdity into something almost philosophical. But beneath the applause, a quieter narrative formed. Every achievement came with shadows. People who wanted to stand close only when the lights were bright, colleagues who mistook collaboration for competition, and moments when laughter backstage felt thinner than the laughter on screen. John, with his capacity for precision, noticed every shift, every hesitation, every fracture. Success had a strange way of amplifying betrayals, making them louder and more permanent. There was one evening, during the height of Python's fame, when he stepped out of a studio into the cold night air. The city lights flickered, cars passed, fans waited nearby, yet he felt entirely alone, as if the applause were happening in another universe. In that moment, the old truth from childhood returned. Trust was delicate. People changed. And sometimes the ones who clapped the loudest were the first to walk away. Still, he pressed forward, because the world demanded more sketches, more scripts, more brilliance. And he delivered. But inside, the first real cracks had begun to form. He didn't name them then. He wouldn't for decades. But they were already there, waiting. Success had carried John through years of bright rooms and echoing applause. But rupture never arrives with an announcement. It slips quietly between two conversations, two rehearsals, two breaths, until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. For John, the first true fracture came not from enemies, but from people he once trusted without hesitation. Fame had stretched every bond thin, and somewhere in that stretch, something tore. It began in a writing room thick with pressure. Deadlines approached, tempers rose, and a single careless remark from someone he considered a confidant cut deeper than he expected. It wasn't the insult itself that wounded him. He had endured far harsher. But the realization behind it, this person, once a partner in creation, now saw him as competition, not companion. In that instant, John felt a familiar chill, the echo of childhood arguments behind a half-closed door. Trust eroded not with a shout, but with a quiet shift in tone. Then came the personal ruptures. Relationships strained under the weight of fame and the demands of perfection he often placed on himself. There were nights when he returned home to silence so heavy it felt like another presence in the room. A partner's disappointed glance, a conversation that ended too quickly, a promise postponed, small fractures that accumulated into something irreversible. John had always used humor to navigate discomfort, but humor cannot stitch a wound inflicted by someone you love. And so, another layer of trust slipped away. The most public rupture, however, arrived when the world was watching. A disagreement, once private, spilled into newspapers and interviews. Words were twisted, intentions distorted, and suddenly John became a caricature of himself in the eyes of those who never knew him. He learned then that betrayal does not always come from individuals. Sometimes it comes from the collective hunger of an audience that wants a narrative more than a truth. That wound lingered longest, being misunderstood by millions. By the time he reached 69, the cracks had grown into a map of betrayals, disappointments, and lessons he never asked to learn. And he carried every one of them quietly, like a set of names carved into the inside of his mind. 5 names, 5 wounds, 5 turning points. 5 names, 5 wounds. 5 turning points that shaped not only the arc of John Cleese's life, but the very architecture of his inner world. When he finally spoke of them at 69, his voice carried neither anger nor bitterness, only a tired clarity, the kind that comes after decades of trying to make sense of pain. Each name was a doorway to a different chapter, a different fracture. And each fracture left a scar he never fully learned to hide. The first person was someone from the early days, long before fame sharpened the edges of every relationship. She was a woman he loved with an earnestness only youth can afford. A relationship built on long conversations, shared secrets, and the naive belief that affection alone could protect them from the world. But affection can be fragile, and promises can falter. She left without warning, without explanation, choosing safety over uncertainty, habit over possibility. For years, John tried to understand her departure, replaying their last days like a scene from a play he could not rewrite. What he never forgave was not the leaving, but the silence, the way she vanished, leaving him to carry questions that had no answers. This was the first lesson. Love can end quietly, long before you realize it has ended. The second name belonged to someone who walked with him through the corridors of comedy, a colleague whose laughter once felt like partnership. Together they had built sketches, ideas, a shared language of absurdity that should have been unbreakable. But fame distorts perspective. It magnifies ego. The colleague began to see John not as an ally but as a rival, someone whose success cast too long a shadow. The betrayal came not through dramatic confrontation, but through subtle sabotage, jokes claimed without credit, comments whispered to producers, a growing resentment disguised as banter. John never confronted him directly. Confrontation would have reduced the wound to something too small. Instead, he carried the disappointment quietly. What he could not forgive was the erosion of trust, the way creation had been turned into competition by someone he once believed was on his side. The third person was family, and that made the wound deeper than any professional betrayal. It was someone whose approval he had chased for years, someone whose pride mattered more to him than he would ever admit publicly. But expectations within a family can be cruel. No success felt enough, no achievement seemed to reach the threshold of what this person believed he should be. Praise was rare, withheld like a luxury. Instead came judgment, comparisons, the unspoken assertion that John's path, comedy, performance, satire, was frivolous. The wound was not caused by a single moment, but by an accumulation of small dismissals, each one carving its mark. What John never forgave was the refusal to see him, truly see him, beyond the stage lights, to recognize the boy who had once longed simply to be told he was enough. The fourth betrayal was the loudest because it was public. It did not come from an individual, but from an institution. The press, the public, the great faceless crowd that consumes stories without considering the people inside them. At the height of his fame, a private conflict was twisted into headlines that painted him as arrogant, difficult, ungrateful. Interviews misquoted him, tabloids exaggerated every gesture, and soon he became a caricature projected onto millions of screens. This wound was made of exposure, the feeling of being judged by people who had only ever seen the surface. What he never forgave was not the criticism itself, but the way truth was discarded so easily, replaced by a narrative that followed him for years. It is one thing to be misunderstood by a friend. It is another to be misrepresented by an entire world. And then there was the fifth person. He paused the longest before naming this one. His hands tightened slightly, his gaze drifting toward the floor, as though the weight of memory pulled it downward. When he finally spoke, his voice softened into something almost fragile. The fifth, he said, is myself. It was not self-loathing, nor melodrama, just recognition. He never forgave himself for the choices he didn't make, the apologies he didn't say, the people he pushed away out of fear they might leave first. He blamed himself for the rigidity that strained his relationships, for the perfectionism that exhausted him, for the emotional walls he built so high that even love couldn't always climb over them. He saw the moments when he raised his voice instead of softening it, when he walked away instead of staying to understand. In the quiet inventory of his life, he recognized his own role in the fractures that shaped him. And this, perhaps, was the deepest wound. The realization that the man he had worked so hard to become had also been the man who hurt himself the most. 5 people, 5 stories, 5 scars he carried into the late evening of his life. In the quiet that followed his confession, John Cleese sat as though a long, tense string inside him had finally loosened. The room around him felt softer now, the shadows less threatening, the dim golden light settling across his shoulders like a gentle hand. Naming those 5 people had not erased their impact, nor dulled the wounds they left behind, but it had given the pain a shape, a boundary, a way to breathe. For the first time in years, he was not running from the past. He was simply acknowledging it. He reached for an old notebook on the table, its cover worn, its pages filled with fragments of thoughts written across decades. Inside were sketches, ideas, sentences crossed out and rewritten, lines of humor beside lines of sorrow. His life, compressed into paper. Yet tonight he didn't write anything new. He simply closed the cover and held it in his hands, as if accepting that the story inside, with all its faults, failures, victories, and fractures, was enough. Imperfect, but enough. Outside the window, the night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, a faint hum of traffic drifted through the air, then faded again into silence. John breathed in slowly, letting the stillness settle around him. 5 faces, 5 lessons, 5 reminders of how deeply one life can be altered by others. And yet, beneath all the scars, there remained a quiet resilience, a stubborn thread of humanity that refused to disappear. He looked up, his gaze steady, almost contemplative, as a final thought passed through him, gentle, unhurried, unresolved. Can a person truly live without forgiving? Or must one sometimes keep the pain, just to remember that they once loved?